Okay, so today's episode is about why you probably have unresolved trauma, but everybody else does too. So what a title for a podcast episode, right? And for those of you that follow me on Instagram, I'm doing a live on this today on my Instagram. But basically today that we're with our 4R formula of reflect, redefine, redesign, and realign, we're reflecting on why everyone probably has a bit of unresolved trauma and why does that even matter. So let's go to the redefine of this, because a lot of people find the word trauma a really big word to deal with. It's hard to hear. It's hard to acknowledge because it feels big the first time you acknowledge it. It feels big the first time you actually accept that things weren't perfect. Or maybe your parents weren't perfect. Maybe life wasn't perfect. And that's a hard pill to swallow because we do tend to lean towards wanting to live in a fantasy land where things are good, problems aren't there. And the more we push things down, the more they come up. You know, there's this saying in the therapy world as well of what we resist persists. So we need to feel things to heal things. And I guess what my work has taught me over the last decade is that if you don't go for the trauma, it's like a fad diet. There's certain things that you can do in the short term that'll work for whatever issue you're facing, whether it's a relationship issue, a parenting issue, a mindset issue. But if you don't get to the anxiety and the depression, if you don't get to the stress, which is underneath all of that is the trauma. If you don't get to the trauma underneath all that, everything you're doing is sort of not really going to work all that well because it's not getting to the root cause thing. So all the work that you do is just going to come back, much like a fad diet. You might lose weight in the short term, but it doesn't last in the long term. And so I want to talk about why many of us have probably had unresolved trauma or trauma in any way. So often people, when they think of trauma, they think of like PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, like people going to war, people being, scared, like in a terrorist attack, like really big things. And don't get me wrong, those are big and those are definitely forms of trauma. But trauma can also be abuse, so sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. But the two kind of most common traumas that I see people either dismiss or don't even realize that's trauma are the emotional abuse, which is like the manipulation, the name calling, the not being treated nicely, or neglect. Neglect in terms of emotional neglect in terms of just being lonely. Those two are really common and really sort of downplayed, and I see them all the time. So, I guess for a lot of people, our whole generation didn't really have parents who normalized emotions because their parents didn't normalize emotions for them. So our grandparents and our great-grandparents, you have to remember they all coming from post-war, so survival mechanisms like emotional validation and connection wasn't high on the priority list. So having your physical needs met, like a roof over your head, food on the table, a good education, that was what mattered. But your emotions, your anxiety, your stress, your sadness, your anger, that kind of wasn't on the radar for them so much. And as we've become more affluent and we don't have to worry about survival all that much, now we're having to deal with this epidemic that so many of us face, which is that emotional neglect or emotional abuse. So either suck it up, princess, don't cry, what have you got to cry about? You've got so much to be grateful for. Why are you upset? You don't have the right to feel that way. Or the opposite of just dealing with emotions on your own. Like if you had a tantrum, your parents walking off on you, if you were feeling sad or angry, instead of your parents sort of being there for you and telling you it's totally okay, like this feeling will pass and I get it, we all feel this way, but your parents sort of pushing that down or making you not want to feel that way or not cry, like that stoicism where it's sort of seen as like a strong thing not to show emotion or cry. And if you were emotional, like there was this sort of negative connotation of maybe you're hysterical. When we don't get our emotions validated like that, so we're either emotionally abused and manipulated or we're emotionally neglected, like not acknowledged at all, that leads to trauma. Now take a breath here, because I know that so many of us have gone through this, and this is why I want to normalize it, is that our whole generation probably went through a lot of this. It was very rare to find a parent in 30, 40, 20 years ago who was good at emotional validation like a lot of parents are now, because there's a lot more books on it. It's very normal. There's some amazing Instagram and social media accounts around emotional validation, but that all wasn't around back then. So for a lot of us, we're having to almost what we call reparent ourselves and realize that it's okay that we didn't have what we needed back then, but we can heal that part of ourselves and move forward. Because what happens is that trauma triggers negative thoughts in us or negative patterns in us. And so those thoughts and patterns, either consciously or unconsciously, will keep showing up for us if we don't get to the core of the trauma. Now, here's the caveat to this. When we get to the third R of our formula, the redesign, processing trauma, I cannot be clearer on this. Get yourself a qualified professional who knows what they're doing. Ask them if they're comfortable with trauma, because I can't tell you how many coaches and things I see out there who are very irresponsible about the inner child work, if they want to call it that, or past life work, or whatever they want to call it. They're very, if you don't know what you don't know. But sometimes if we tap into those really painful memories without changing them, without changing our interaction with them, we can actually strengthen them. So that pain can be strengthened. Those negative thoughts can be strengthened. Those negative patterns can be strengthened if not done correctly. And I actually see a lot of coaches doing that inadvertently because they probably don't know. But that's why you need qualified clinicians, because they know this. They know the neurobiology around it. So please, 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 if there's one thing you do, if you think to yourself, wow, I probably have some unresolved trauma there that I want to process, you can come to us at Savasana Collective, because as we grow, the clinicians that I work with are outsourced to, or even when you work with me in the membership or in our women's circles at our retreats, it is all trauma informed, okay? So our clinicians know what they're doing, but find yourself someone who does. And what happens in trauma processing, you're probably wondering? Well, it changes from person to person, but long story short, our central nervous system, which is the system that controls our stress responses and how we feel, it goes up through our body into our brain and down from our brain into our body. It's a big connected system. Becomes dysregulated when we experience trauma. So we have to work in what we call bottom-up ways, so body to brain ways, to regulate the central nervous system. So this might include meditation, breathing, visualization, smell, like lots of bodily sort of functions and exercises. And then what we call top-down approaches, which is really once we started to do some things on the central nervous system, then we can kind of cognitively look at what thought patterns are coming up and sort of diffusing from that. So when a negative feeling comes up, a negative thought comes up, we can acknowledge it and let it go, or acknowledge its presence, and know that it doesn't have the power over us because we are differentiating ourselves from it. We're diffusing from it. So that is that. Now the realign, what do we do? Like once we've acknowledged this, we're working on this, realizing that it's part of your experience and it's part of the human experience, as much as this sucks to hear sometimes, pain is part of life, but it makes the beautiful moments far more beautiful. It makes us more grateful for when things are good. It makes us grateful to be a parent. I think a lot of us when we become parents, we heal those sort of child wounds we didn't have, or those child wounds come to the surface. I certainly found as when I became a parent 3 years ago that there was a whole bunch of emotions that I did not even realize were going on for me that I had to process to become a good parent to my own child. And it's a daily thing. I'll be triggered sometimes, and that's totally okay. I can acknowledge that because I know what it is now. I have words around it. I can put it around it. So please know you have got this. I have got you. You have got your own back, and I have got your back too. So please know it's a journey. No, it's not easy, but of course it's totally worth it. It makes life colorful. If we had nothing but light, it would be a very stale kind of painting to look at if we looked at life. But it's the light and the shadows that bring a painting to life. And sometimes we need those shadows, As Rumi says, the darkness is where the light enters you, or the pain is where the light enters you. I don't remember it exactly, but it's one of those mornings, you know what I mean? But it is that. It's just the pain is where the light enters you, and that empathy you have for humankind, for your children, for your partner, for the world around us changes when you get in tune with your trauma. You open it, you process it, and you realize hey, everyone has this. When people are being nasty, that's their trauma showing. When people can't function because they're just so overwhelmed with emotion, that's their trauma showing. I see you, I feel you, and I get it. And you'll have more empathy for people rather than just going, well, that guy's a dick. He's just being so rude. I cannot deal. Of course it's normal to feel that. But afterwards you can go, oh, I know, that's his trauma and that's his stuff. And he obviously has stuff to work through. So, all right, well, I hope this was an educational one for you. Might be interesting to listen to this one on a Monday morning. But I ask you to notice if something like that's coming up for you. Notice what emotions came up for you listening to this podcast today. Did it make you feel uncomfortable? Were there memories that were kicking in? And why were those memories kicking in for you? It's not an accident if you're listening to this and a certain memory or a certain person or a certain age came up for you. There's a reason, because that probably is attached to some uncomfortable feelings. So noticing that, and then perhaps noticing when some negative patterns or default things are coming up for you this week. All right, I wish you nothing but the best. You know where to find us. And of course, if you're loving this podcast, share it with me. Tag me on Instagram. Share it with the world. I think we're creating a really beautiful community here, and I can't wait to share more with you. And of course, follow us to make sure that you'll be the first when we reopen Wild Ocean Co., our membership, or when we go away on the retreats at Noosa and the Sunshine Coast. Beautiful. You'll be the first one to know about it. All right, you take care. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you next time. Hey, I'm Sheena Shuey. I'm a registered social worker and host of the 4Q podcast. I'm passionate about normalizing, not pathologizing life, and that's not easy. So each episode, I have amazing guests on to share the messy, beautiful ups and downs of life in 4 key questions with tips and tricks along the way. There are moments in life where you can embrace your story and understand that it's okay not to feel okay sometimes. So let's get into it. This is the 4Q podcast.